You're listening to Energy Insiders, a weekly update on clean energy and climate policy with Renew Economy's editor Giles Parkinson and leading energy analyst David Leach. Energy Insiders is brought to you by Evergen, providing cutting-edge energy management software for battery optimisation, virtual power plants and distributed energy resources. And Pylon, helping solar installers and retailers design high-resolution solar proposals in minutes.
Hello and welcome to this latest episode of the Energy Insiders podcast. My name is Giles Parkinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Renew Economy and editor of the EV-focused The Driven. And joining me as usual is ITK principal David Leach. David, I trust you are well and stocked up for Easter.
Yes, Giles, and I wish all our listeners and yourself a happy Easter and an enjoyable one. And now, back on topic, we've got a great...
Sorry to drag you off.
We've got a great interview talking about my new best and most important topic for a while, the emerging frontier in heavier vehicle electrification, or at least emissions reduction.
Yes, you do. Yeah, send you to a conference, David, and you're going to come back with a whole bunch of podcast ideas, which is the purpose of these things. So that's good. We first had Gareth Ridge from Zenobe on this podcast back in early 2021 when he was talking about the electrification of the Leichhardt bus depot. Well, things have moved on quite a bit since then. David heard about the Smart Energy Conference, was really impressed with what he heard, and so we had him back onto the podcast. And we'll come back after this with the quick discussion of the news of the week, but let's have a listen to our discussion with Gareth Ridge from Zenobe. Gareth Ridge, country manager EV for Zenobe. Thanks very much for joining this podcast.
It's great to be here.
Look, there's quite a lot to talk about. This idea of sort of electric trucks as a service, powering school buses, second life batteries. But just tell us, start off with telling us a bit about Zenobe, because it's kind of come from nowhere. You're only established in 2017, sort of just a blink ago, but you've already raised several $1 billion. Just tell us, give us a bit of a flavour about how it came about.
Yeah, sure. So as you said, 2017 was the year we kicked off in the battery grid scale storage sector. Soon after that, and this was in the UK, in 2019, we actually did our first EV project. So we branched out from doing grid scale storage as one of the first players in the UK to being the first player to provide electric bus charging infrastructure services. And that came about because of a customer who was looking to actually electrify, and it was going to cost them over £2 million and take between 12 to 24 months because the grid operator couldn't give them any more certainty than that. And because of our battery knowledge, we then said to them, well, we can actually come in here with a battery solution and provide you with charging services or charging infrastructure at a fraction of the cost and get it up and running in 3 months. And so from that, the customer obviously loved it and said, let's do this. And then from that, the rest is history. And we've now developed over 100 commercial vehicle sites, that bus and truck depots, but primarily the bus depots. And we have over 700 megawatts of contracted energy, grid scale energy storage. And we're now in many jurisdictions around the world, with Australia and New Zealand being the second largest jurisdiction.
And Gareth, just before handing back to Giles, that's on the asset side. On the funding side, are you structured as a company that has private pension fund money or debt? I mean, where does the capital to run and grow the business assets come from?
Yeah, so we have two major shareholders, Infra Capital and KKR. And they've invested quite a lot of equity in the business, but all our projects are a mixture of debt and equity funded. So we primarily get a lot of debt into our projects and then fill the rest up with, or take on the residual risk on the equity side as well. So we are, I guess, infrastructure backed. So we like to deploy capital in the areas that we work, both grid scale storage, but also in this EV sector. And that's why we're focused quite a lot on this EV as a service, where we can deploy our capital, our equity, as well as getting debt out the door.
So it sounds like you're sort of a battery storage company that just saw this sort of big hole in the market, which is really just trying to connect all those big electricity users, particularly the sort of the larger scale electric vehicles, be they trucks or buses. Before we get to that, I mean, just tell us about the people who founded this business. I mean, are we talking about a couple of pointy-headed engineers who just sort of wonked their way into a good spot, or a sort of hairy-chested sort of entrepreneurial types who thought, aha, batteries, buses, let's do it?
Yeah, it's actually interesting. Three founders originally kicked off the business back then. They've actually got a very complementary and different background. One's a consultant, had a consulting background, and the other one is a corporate finance banker, and the other one's an engineer. So they sort of brought together all their knowledge within that sector.
I was kind of right then. So you had one of each.
Exactly. So you tick them off, but yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, so look, let's get back into the details of what you're actually doing then in Australia. And look, one of the recent announcements you've made is about creating an off-site charging facility for Woolworths. And that's really interesting because Woolworths was trying to, well, they were struggling to figure out how to get their sort of trucks charged, and you've obviously come in and given them a solution, and I presume it sort of combines battery storage to allow the sort of access to the grid. But perhaps you can sort of go into some sort of detail of what happened and why, and some of the issues that you may have actually with sort of creating such large loads somewhere within the grid, and how you dealt with the networks, and what your solution was.
Yeah, sure. So this is a market first, not only in Australia but in the UK. So where our sort of home market is. So no one's done anything like this, and there's probably maybe in China they have these offsite hubs, but we haven't seen any yet in the areas that we work. And this came about because we saw through our customer Woolworths, and we're seeing it across the market, a number of barriers to adopting electric vehicles, and that was primarily over 5 things. So one was land, having the space and how you want to use that land, and whether it's being currently used for logistics purposes, and there might not be enough space for charging infrastructure. Grid constraints at the particular sites where the customer are based or where they have their vehicles. Short contract lengths where the asset lives aren't actually aligned to what the contract is with the logistics companies that service those customers. High capital costs, as you can imagine, with big grid infrastructure costs and the cost of the vehicles themselves, so between 2 to 3 times the cost of a diesel. And then lastly, the ownership structures, which is a bit sometimes complicated, where you've got a mixture of either owner drivers, subcontractors, or in-house drivers. So this model was set up to try and overcome those barriers, and that particular project is supported by ARENA funding, and that's one of the reasons why they're interested, is because we're breaking down some of those barriers to adoption. And so what we've seen is I'll just share some of the learnings to date, and we're still in the process of building that site. But getting land in some of these key areas, for example, this site's in Mascot, has been quite a challenge. But getting grid to the site hasn't been a huge challenge. Now, this site does have a battery, one of our second life batteries, so it's old bus and truck batteries that we've got the IP on putting them together to then redeploy onto sites like this, to mitigate our peak demand use in that peak demand window for Ausgrid. And so we've put that there to help mitigate the cost, and also as a bit of a contingency. But yeah, we haven't actually found the grid too much of an issue in this particular instance, although sometimes it is. But what I guess we can do is we can spread all those costs, the grid costs, land costs, and other capital costs over a longer period of time, because we can take a longer term view on how we can utilize those assets, rather than what a typical customer might look at, which is 3 to 5 year horizon, and then think, okay, well, we're not going to make a return on all that investment, so we're not going to move. And that's what we're trying to break down here.
And so just there's a number of things that come to mind on that, but just overall, I guess the hard heads want to understand, if you look at the total cost of ownership, which is the phrase that the truck industry uses, which is the same as the LCOE, or the net present value, or internal rate of return, You can. How does it actually look at the end of the day if you hold the vehicle long enough and you can sell the battery, for second purpose, etc.?
It is TCO positive, or TCO neutral and positive. Admittedly, this project, as I said, has had some arena funding, but when we get commitments from customers that are longer than 3 to 5 years, we're starting to see the economics stack up at around the 10 to 15-year mark, and that aligns with the way we're seeing I guess, useful life of assets. So, for example, the trucks, you're getting a useful life around 10 years or more, depending on the asset class or how heavy the vehicle is. And then, if you're looking at grid upgrades, chargers, etc., they're 10 plus years as well. So once we can start to align to that, and then once we can start to get high utilization of the vehicles, you start to utilize the OPEX savings from switching from diesel to electric to actually pay for those higher upfront costs, and it's about that 10 plus year mark where we're starting to see the tipping point. And that's where we're trying to push the market to start thinking longer term, rather than in today's world everything's sort of diesel. Well, 99% of the market is, so it's harder to shift that, but if we can, I think we'll start to see quite a big movement in the market.
Yes, this is a big topic. So I wanted to remind, I learned at the Smart Energy Conference that, as electricity is decarbonised, transport is going to become the biggest source of emissions, along with heat. But transport's really big, and trucks are 40% of total transport emissions. That's something I learnt, and I think politicians and policymakers need to be very conscious of. And I learned also that there's essentially zero policy in regard to supporting this transition other than what comes through ARENA. So this conversation is about understanding the issues here as far as I'm concerned. But if I look forward a little bit more, one of the things that struck me is this 2 to 3 times cost. Because I don't think that's so much the case in the car industry anymore. I mean, there's obviously a cost premium still, but I don't think anyone thinks it's 3 times, or probably even 2 times. Maybe you could just talk about that for a second.
Yeah, sure. So we're already seeing that 2 to 3 times come down dramatically, and that's just the product of more supply coming to the market, newer OEMs coming in from China, in particular. And you would have seen in passenger space like BYD coming in and dropping the price of passenger vehicles, and we're seeing similar in the trucking space. So we think that will drop quite a bit over time, even as the European providers come in with more options. We're also seeing, the energy density of batteries improve quite a lot over time, and that then helps the cost of those vehicles improve, and also the range of those vehicles improve. So that's what some of our, well, I mean, all logistics companies will look at the payload that you can get and how many kilometers it can do in a day. So if you can get for the same price, more range, more payload, etc., then that makes the TCO stack up a bit more. But yeah, I think also at the lighter end of the sector, you're seeing closer to like 2 or less than 2 times. But as you get to the heavier end, it's up towards the 3. But again, that aligns quite neatly to the fact that you've actually got less vehicles, less options in the heavier side, whereas in the lower end, you've got more options to pick from as well. So it's supply and demand's sort of showing.
Absolutely. And then maybe you could also, it's not just the trucks, as you point out, it's the charging infrastructure. And when I heard about the Volvo and project as well with their 36 prime movers, it seems to work best when you've got one charging sort of separate area, and the trucks do a round trip and return to that charging area, as opposed to your long haul, Sydney to Melbourne or whatever, Brisbane to Sydney, whatever it might be.
Correct. Yeah, that's exactly right. So the first sectors that we're looking at and that will be electrified because of the economic stack up is that depot based models, and that's exactly as you said. The economics of it makes sense because you can utilize those assets. You don't have to deploy multiple chargers along a route or anything, and that's why for us, we're in the bus space quite a bit, and that's obviously depot based. We can translate exactly all those learnings we've done across 100 odd depots in the bus space straight to truck depots, because it is a similar model where they go out, they do a certain yes, the routes aren't fixed, but you can predict how long the kilometers will be and the load, the draw on the batteries will be. And then, so that is a lot easier, and that's the lower hanging fruit. The harder stuff will be the point to point, as you said.
And Gareth, you talked about selling the electric transport as a service. So, do you actually own the trucks in this case and their batteries, or do Woolworths own those and you just own the charging infrastructure?
Yes, so we do own everything. So this trucks as a service model, which has come from what we've done as electric vehicles as a service in the bus space as well, is a full offering where we deploy and own and fund all the assets. So that includes the vehicles, the trucks, charging infrastructure, including all the grid upgrades. We provide the energy to the customer as well, and then we set that back to the customer as a service, as a flat fee over a certain period of time. So that it obviously fits well with what we were trying to do, because we can align up the lengths of or the return on those capital investments, but it takes away all the technology risk from our customers.
I think so, and all the integration risks and all the different parties that are involved. I read a discussion about that. I don't want to get into that discussion but I'm sure listeners can appreciate just how many different parties and second and third party checks and people having to, commit to say that they're happy to be sacked if they got this wrong, and et cetera, and you avoid all of that. Now, if I just turn to buses, and I want to hand back to Giles, but this is such an interesting topic to me. In New South Wales in 2017, I think it was, New South Wales committed to making all its buses electric by 2030. And as far as I can see, they've got up to 65 in Leichhardt, close to where I used to live. And they've now been happy enough to get to 200, I think it is, over the next year or so. But it's still a long way to get to 8,000. But I mean, I just wonder how that's working out from what you're seeing. Have they been happy enough with how it's gone with the ones done to date?
Yes, yeah, there was a bit of backtracking on that target, unfortunately, because it was quite great to have an ambitious target of all 8,000 by 2030. It would have been a challenge, but I feel like the market always gets there. But the yeah, they've been happy with Transport, and other public transport authorities are happy with what they're seeing from the vehicles and the range and everything. I know that some of our customers in those early days, like 2020 odd, were so worried that they'd just do buses on sort of circular routes around the depot, worried that it wouldn't make the range. But now they just put them in the fleet like any other bus, and it does any route that's needed. It's not allocated to low routes at all. So there's a lot of confidence in the vehicles that they can do exactly what they want, and there's lower maintenance costs as well. So the governments are now, Transport for New South Wales has released their newer plan, which is, first wave is 1,200 buses or thereabouts, that are being deployed now over the next couple of years, the depots that support them, which is about 11 or 12 depots. And then there's another 1,200 odd buses that will be in the next wave over the next 5 years, I think. I can't remember the exact numbers they're aiming
No,
for,
but
yeah.
it's happening. And then if we move around the states, in Victoria, I think you're doing a project at Ivanhoe. I
Correct.
believe that's in Victoria, not Scotland, where I might have guessed. And there's 27 buses, which is, I guess, something.
Yeah, look, that's a small depot, but it's an all electric depot. So it was the first time I think anyone had done an all electric depot. So they don't have any diesel spares, and I guess that's a big step, taking the market to be like, all right, well, if charges are down or grids down, in that up to that point there was always partial depot conversion. So whilst it's a small depot, we've had to put in some backup diesel generator points, which might not seem great in this sort of EV transition, but it does just provide, if you need to, for extended grid outages, then you can put in
Security.
Yeah, exactly. But it's by no means it's all powered by renewable energy, but there are backup options that we've had to consider for that site.
I do have to hand it back to Giles, but I do want to come back and talk about using solar for charging and secondhand batteries, which is interesting. But if I just keep running around the states very quickly, I don't believe Adelaide, despite all its renewable energy, has any electric buses or anything just yet, does it?
No, they've just recently
It's got one.
they've just recently done an announcement. I think they'll do 60. But yeah, I'm also have been a bit perplexed by that when they're such a market leader in the renewable space with the batteries and renewables. I think I'm hoping that they'll start to move quite quickly, but yeah, there's not a lot happening.
That's probably the South Australian government on the line right now, or the Adelaide Council. But
To announce that they've got two.
and Brisbane or Queensland.
Brisbane is moving, but slow. There was also an announcement in partnership with QIC and TMR that they're going to do. I think it was around 400, but again, not. They have got some electrics up there, probably in the less than 50. But yeah, slow moving. Transport for New South Wales is leading the way in terms of scale electrification. Tasmania, I think, just did a trial of 3 recently, so not a lot happening down there. And ACT, to their credit as well, are moving quite quickly on a percentage basis. So I think they have a pretty ambitious plan to convert their 400 or 500.
And my last question before I hand back to Giles, just very quickly, sorry, is just on does Zenobe still have the appetite to put more capital? I mean, if someone wanted to do a couple of thousand buses, is the money there going to be to provide that as a service? I mean, I guess it'd be quite expensive.
Oh, by all means. I mean, the bigger the better for us. I mean, we have very well backed and very, very well supported by large financial institutions as well, who are very, very keen to put money behind this, both from our shareholders and those the debt providers. So, yeah, we look at multi-hundred, and would be happy with 1,000 bus transactions to make this happen. It is large numbers, because if you think a bus costs anywhere between $600,000 or $700,000 to $1 million. That's not including all the infrastructure works. It's quite a lot of money, but yeah, there's no stopping us in terms of size.
Just make an observation. I was actually up in Brisbane last weekend, and we did actually notice the sort of the trackless trams, which I guess is sort of the type of electric bus. There was a few of them moving around the place, and that was good to see. Because they are so much cleaner and they're silent compared to there's something. I don't live in a city, and I always get shocked when I go to the city and hear the diesel motors of the buses when you're sitting next to them at an intersection. It's just extraordinary. And one other observation, apart from the ACT, it's quite ironic that the 2 states which have the highest share of renewables, South Australia through wind and solar, and Tasmania through hydro and wind, should be the slowest, it seems, on the uptake of on EV buses. Which leads me to the next question about your sort of your trucking as a service model, and I guess you could do busing as a service. Could that be applied then to the state governments? I mean, because obviously they've got their own sort of logistic and supply plans and their own sort of commitments. They would have the same issues, struggling with understanding the technologies and the technology risk, as David mentioned before. Have you had any sort of discussions with governments about doing that for them?
Yes, we are. And it does make sense, because a lot of the depots are owned by the states, and in some cases, a lot of the buses are owned as well. So yeah, we are in discussions about different models where well, there is at one end you've got your full electric, EV as a service, or public transport as a service almost. But within that there's components. There's the charging infrastructure, there's the vehicle, and within the vehicle there's the battery. So in particular, the batteries and the other technology risk around the chargers are definitely of interest to the states, whether we're providing it via an operator or direct to the state itself. And if you look at the batteries side, just to give you, in your listeners some numbers, there's the batteries on buses are about 400 kilowatt hours. And there's 30,000 buses, but if you look at commercial vehicles, there's 4 million of them. And we've quick numbers on commercial vehicles. If we average them all out, that's 440 odd gigawatt hours of batteries that would be sitting on wheels if you electrified the whole commercial vehicle market. So there's a lot of batteries that are going to be needed to be put in both buses and trucks, and the whole of life considerations the governments are definitely thinking about. And I think there's quite an opportunity here to mitigate the risk, one, but create secondary markets and industry through the repurposing and redeployment of those batteries within Australia to help mitigate and bolster the grid, which is what we talk about in another episode.
Yeah, well, about 400 kilowatt hours is about the size of your average sort of neighbourhood or community battery, which we've been discussing recently with the likes of Ausgrid and Essential Energy. Before I hand back to David, because he's on a roll, and I've only got a few questions, I'm interested in vehicle to grid. That was a big subject of the Smart Energy Conference. It's been a sort of fascinating point of interest for buyers of passenger cars. I read that in the United States, school buses are being used because they use at particular times. So they charge, they take kids to school, they go back, charge and feed back into the grid and do the afternoon run and then go back and do the same thing at all. Have you got any possibilities? Are you looking at that in Australia, and how far are we away in Australia from having that sort of service? Because as you say, these are significant batteries.
Yeah, we're not so much in Australia. We have a US team, and they are seeing that as well. What you're talking about, and it is exactly, you hit the nail on the head, that it is because of that, the time of use really, and the application of those vehicles. What we're seeing with buses, and it also applies to trucks, is they need every bit of capacity through the day, or most of it, to do what it needs to do, but also to not put so much strain on the grid at the night to then charge up. So usually, there's a bit of buffer over the night to charge it up, but you wouldn't want to be adding additional capacity that you need to charge because you've been feeding that into the grid. So it just doesn't make sense as it currently stands with the battery capacities and the use cases for these vehicles. And I dare say, even if you get a bit bigger batteries, the vehicles will get used more rather than using it as a vehicle to grid option. So no, we're not seeing a lot of that because of the use case, and you need every bit of that capacity. But in a similar vein to what vehicle to grid does, what we are doing globally is something similar, which is basically like a demand response mechanism, where we have our software that sits on the chargers and has a similar effect, where we basically throttle down the charge rate to provide more capacity or more energy on the grid. So we're doing that in a different way, rather than actually getting power from the battery. We're just changing the power rate, and that can be put into a market, and then we can get paid for that. Australia is still developing those markets, but we are doing that in the UK. So that's where I think you'll go with buses and trucks in Australia.
What Global Rome calls negawatts demand response. Talk to me a little bit about the actual charging compounds, or the vehicle compounds, in the sense that I think you put like 40 chargers or something typically into one, and they're 120 kilowatts, and then you have software. But I mean, you couldn't have all 40 buses charging. That'd be like a 4 megawatt or something, 5 megawatt load. And I think so you must manage to charge them sequentially, or have some part charging, or how does all that work? Just don't want to go into too much detail, but just generally understand the thought process that underlies it.
Yeah, sure. Look, it really depends. It's a use by use case scenario, where we go through and look at it, what makes sense. But just at a high level, you're getting chargers, fast chargers, DC chargers, upwards from usually around 60 kilowatts, but then all the way up to megawatt charging we're seeing. So megawatt charging will completely is a game changer for the whole trucking and bus sector. But at the moment, there's a lot of focus on around 150 kilowatt chargers with dual guns, and yes, the best way to do it is to leverage smart charging software, like what we have, and there's others in the market, where that software will regulate the charging as needed to ensure that the buses or trucks are have enough capacity in the morning to do the routes required. If you simply just plug them all in, it'll either trip the grid, and then that's obviously an issue, or you're just charging too much at peak demand windows, where you're going to pay a lot more than you need to be. So we try to delay charging to help with energy costs, and we also throttle it down as needed, and then use a bit of smarts to know which buses need to get out first, at 6 a.m. or 5 a.m. And make sure they're charged up before the ones that have to go out later.
And other than other than the second-hand batteries, there's really no way to access the solar excess in the middle of the day because, as you say, trucks and buses all want to be out on the road at lunchtime.
Correct. Yeah, there's no other way. But to put it in context, you need so much solar on these sites that you're not going to be able to power, a large portion of the fleet. If I give you an example, Leichhardt Depot has the whole depot is plastered with solar, but that would only power, I think, around 20 vehicles or there.
400 kilowatts or something, I think they've got there. I think I read, but I mean, but you can buy solar at the moment in the middle of the day for zero, but that's not much use to you.
No, not much unless we start to develop incentives like that, where we can see intraday charging. And to be honest, some routes. So there's two peaks in public transport. There's a morning peak and an afternoon peak. So there are a portion, a decent portion of the buses that are there in the middle of the day, so they could leverage that solar. It's not going to be the whole fleet, but if you can start to think, rather than trying to shift all the charging into the night, actually start to use those lower demand windows in the middle of the day where it's not an AM or a PM peak, then yes, you could use a bit of it.
And just quickly, would that because I want to talk about trucks rather than buses and charging, but just quickly, would that improve the economics significantly if they all did charge in the middle of the day?
Yeah, well, if you're getting access to very low cost of energy, yeah, probably would have a decent impact. Yeah, I think it would.
Great. Now we've talked about buses, and we've talked a little bit about the one Woolworths depot, and Volvo's got I forget who with a large contract supported again by Arena. But what's the interest from the trucking industry generally? I was struck that most of the industry is small operators with 5 or less trucks, I think I heard. And they're obviously not going to be rushing into buying electric trucks. It's far too risky, blah, blah, blah. But they might be interested in leasing them. But there are a lot of big transport operators as well. I just wondered how and that some of them will have social obligations or think about carbon emissions. What do you think the prospects are good?
Yeah, obviously the big players have started to move first, and you're right. There's a huge owner driver segment that use these light commercial vehicles or under 4.5 ton, and they can just use passenger license. So, and they would typically take those vehicles home, but they have similar barriers. Whilst the charging infrastructure is not high, the vehicle cost is high, but we're trying to come up with models to overcome barriers for them, and then separately you would look at what are the challenges for the larger fleet owners, offsite hubs or on-site electrification. But there is a huge segment that we are live working on a sort of portfolio approach to see how we can take a greater risk or a position on the risk of those segments where there's people owning 5 or less trucks, but still give them the benefit of what we see for the larger people, which is looking at these assets over a longer period of time. So yeah, you're right. There is a challenge there with the smaller ones, but there is a lot of interest as well. So I don't think it's unsolvable, and I think as long as there's interest, we will get there.
I'll just make an observation that, we run electric trains in Sydney, which are fairly big pieces of business. And we just built a new metro very successfully in Sydney, which runs electrically and was a public-private partnership. So it seems to me these things, with enough will and determination, can actually be made to work fairly well.
Definitely. I think, there's so much to be done. And I think, when I look at the size of the market, as I said, 4 million vehicles, the current forecasts are only seeing less than 1% of that being electric in 5 years. So there's so much potential that we can do here. And with that transition, there's obviously a lot of capital that needs to be deployed, which is going to attract a lot of, private investors and players to innovate.
Just on that, sorry to interrupt, but this interests me because I already mentioned that there's no policy support pretty much whatsoever. And there was a question at Smart Energy about what kind of policies work best. And I mean, or whether they need to be a combination. I mean, you can have sticks like we have in the car industry now, where you have tailpipe emission standards, or you can have carrots where you have like certificates that people can buy or be offered, or direct subsidies. You must have had some thoughts about what you think would do most to get this market moving along and get us to the point where people become more comfortable with it and don't have individual decisions don't take quite so long.
Yeah, well, I think that, I mean, in terms of carrots, Arena is doing a fantastic job of bringing these projects to life, whether it's the Volvo project you talk about, or what we're doing. There's other projects that I'm surely working on. So that is doing wonders for the industry, given it brings new OEMs to market. It gives people confidence that these things work, and it shows the different commercial models. So I think more of that happening in across the nation, and even at the state level. That's probably what's missing, is state types of carrot incentives, if you want to call it that. I think going down the stick option. I don't know. I wouldn't sort of support anything that's out there, but I think encouraging longer term thinking where possible. It's hard for government to sort of get involved in that in the commercial vehicle space, but where possible, to incentivize contract lengths to be longer, or residual value, or positions, or even supporting manufacturing of batteries at their end of life, can start to help people like us think about how we can create a better market here, and then create better residual value positions to then overall reduce the cost of these types of transitions.
And in terms of risk, charging infrastructure is always a big risk for users of the system. I know that we all know that from electric car experience, and I wonder if more support in building, general purpose charging infrastructure, including like megawatt charging stuff, would help if there were more chargers around the place that were built by an organisation with some government support. Would that help?
Yeah, I definitely think it would help. I think you made me think of one other point in that councils. They could probably help a lot by streamlining the planning permissions for these types of projects. There's already a streamlined process for buses, but trucks haven't gotten there yet. So that planning process could help quite a lot. But yeah, having also on the council side, they're looking to facilitate or electrify their plant and equipment. So having shared facilities where maybe a council depot is electrified, but the other half of it is used for like commercial vehicles. So having those types of projects that are funded by, whether it's council, state, or federal government, would help light commercial and heavy commercial vehicles know that there's actually some quite fast chargers around there that they can leverage, or at least have as backup options, or test vehicles on.
You mentioned councils, and I think they have a terribly important role to play in the community. I don't say that just because my mum was a mayor, a very successful one, but also, I mean, they had big programs to electrify things like garbage trucks and whatever. But as soon as, like everyone else in the community, as soon as there's a bit of financial hardship, that the electrification program is pretty much the first thing to go out the window. Is there anything happening in that space that you know of?
Yeah, we're looking at electric garbage trucks, looking at electric council vehicles as well. You're right, though. If it doesn't stack up financially, it doesn't really go anywhere. But it all comes back to looking long term, and councils have the ability to look long term. They can say, all right, well, we're happy with a model where it's going to be paid off over a 10, 15, 20-year process, and we have guarantees that all this equipment will work. But if they don't put that forward in the tenders and the like, then it's harder to stack up. But if they do, then I think they'll be getting offers that are all TCO neutral or positive, and they can transition quite easily with low risk or no risk, and not paying any more for it than what they would under their diesel models.
Well, I don't know if Giles has got more questions, Gareth. I'm sure this is a topic that we're going to come back to lots more times because it's a really big and important and interesting topic. And we're right at the beginning of what's going to be a fantastic process, I'm sure. But what do you think, Giles?
No, thank you very much, Gareth. It's been great having you back on the podcast. I just went back and I just realised I thought it was the Driven podcast. Was actually on this podcast 4 years ago, talking about that Leichhardt bus station. So yeah, welcome back and great to see you advancing further. It's fantastic.
No, great to be on, and thank you for the opportunity.
And that was Gareth Ridge from Zenobe. We'll be back after this break. You are listening to the Energy Insiders podcast with Giles Parkinson and David Leach. And it's funny you mentioned that thing about councils, David, and whether they're engaged or not. I saw a story on the ABC this week of a council in Queensland, the Livingston Council, announced just 2 weeks ago of their plan to install EV chargers around the Shire because they thought that was a really, really good idea. And then I think the mayor and some councillors watched this report on Channel 7 about this incredibly dirty nickel mine in Indonesia and decided to pull that EV charging commitment on the basis that this mine was sort of feeding nickel into EV batteries. Now, there's a couple of issues here. One, it's a pretty uninformed reaction. Two, the mining in Indonesia can be an absolute environmental disaster and disaster for the people working there. Three, that mine does not produce nickel of a grade good enough to go into EV batteries, and most of that nickel is used to make steel. So it'll be interesting to see if the council actually decides it's going to stop any investments that require steel in its shire, because that would be consistent.
Well, Giles, I think this is the point about echo chambers and scare campaigns. They do work until people look into them more carefully, and I'm sure that most councils have managers and councillors that take their responsibilities seriously, and if they're going to do something, look into it properly. I won't say anything more about that, but I would say that more generally, I think it's likely that this election energy policy does matter. As we've discussed, the LNP's policy has been a mess from start to finish. And as they've realised it's not selling, they've changed the policy on the fly, moving from nuclear to gas. And as terms of gas, the sort of I would not be surprised if gas was to replace renewables in some form of CIS, and that you'd get long-term tenders for new gas generation. And maybe some is needed, but you wouldn't get anything else, and you certainly wouldn't get any more renewables development. And getting stuck where we are now, as John Grimes has mentioned, it just seems to me an absolutely terrible outcome. It's hard to convince the general public about it because it is, in all honesty, a topic where you need to do some work to really understand it. But the people who listen to this podcast generally do, and I think they're the ones who fully understand and will put the message out in the communities that it does matter. Energy policy is an underlying driver. It's only one. I mean, both parties are giving away housing money as if in a fashion that's despised by all economists. But energy policy is a serious point of difference.
Well, and as you say, I mean, you when I talked about Livingston Council, you talked about the sort of the echo chamber, and I think that's been exactly the coalition and the LNP's problem, is that they basically, particularly Peter Dutton and Ted O'Brien, they've talked to their own echo chambers, and then when they found out that it doesn't pass the sniff or the pub test, not just for the energy industry but also the sort of the broader population, they have, as you said, had to make it up on the run, and looking foolish for doing so. So. That is pretty interesting. And look, I'll also observe some of the things that some of the extraordinary things that are happening up in Queensland at the moment. And we discussed, I think, last week about their decision to row back on the renewable energy target. They're now indicating that they're even going to sort of reassess their emissions reduction target, which they had wholeheartedly supported last year. They extended the life of the Callide generator even after an explosion in the neighbouring one.
Well, its life will be much longer now, Giles, because it blew up. They sacked all the people who knew anything about it, and now they've got to repair it before they can run it for longer.
And now you're getting these sort of Trumpian type things where you've got this sort of the utility, the CS Energy utility, sort of putting out this bizarre press release this week. So sort of say, yes, well, look, we're at fault because we failed to tell the government strongly enough how serious this incident was. So you can just imagine just some of the shit that's going down there and the bloody emails going around and the pressure on the board and stuff like that. It's just, it's really quite extraordinary. A complete nut of stuff up, and I'm not really too sure where they go from there. But what I do notice that they've now imposed this thing where the generators have to come clean about their outages. So we also got a release this afternoon from CleanCo, just pointing out that their Swanbank gas generator had tripped because of a fault and was out of action. So that's actually quite interesting.
Yes, they've got to come clean, but they can't be clean. That's, I think, the new motto. And of course, it didn't stop Stanwell, I believe it is, announcing yet another battery to be built. And I think when I did some work this week at looking at peaking generation, because the market shares, it's not just the fuels, which we talk about a lot, but the market has a lot of other things going on in the underlying economics, like the actual players and market concentration and the general business aspects as opposed to the electricity business aspects. And as the coal generators do go away, we're going to see a change in who's running the show in the evenings. And batteries, as we've discussed many times, utility batteries and I hope some behind-the-meter batteries are going to be doing a lot more of the action in the evenings and shift the market shares around. And look, obviously investors, no matter what government policy is, investors generally are still investing in utility batteries at a great rate of knots. Even over the past month, as far as I can work out, there's been about another gigawatt of batteries committed. A gigawatt's a lot of money,
Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah. And look, we actually did see a couple of weeks ago, we reported on in South Australia, look, it was a sort of confluence of events, a lot of imports from Victoria, not a huge amount of demand, but because of the new Blythe battery, which has been commissioned successfully on time and on budget, batteries accounted for 30% at one point of the evening peak. In fact, it was a peak of 34%, and it was 30% for about an hour. So that's the similar sort of thing that we've been seeing in California over the last year or so. And I think nationwide, God, I can't remember the number now, but it's well over 5% at times, because we're seeing a lot of these new batteries now. The Waratah Super Battery, there's a couple of other big batteries in Victoria and Queensland. They're all going through their commissioning process now, so they're all going through periods where they're injecting a lot more into the grid as they progress through those hold points. And so pretty soon we're going to see batteries accounting for moments of more than 10% of evening demand, and then inevitably it will jump to 20 and 30% as it has in California and soon will be in Texas.
And as mentioned several times, what really matters is who's doing the bidding and what price they're bidding and what their economic motivation is. But we won't talk more about that now, Giles. It's coming up to Easter, and probably some of our listeners want a holiday from us as well as anything else. I did want to mention that in Texas, which I keep an eye on, there's a bill going through the Senate now, which is kind of requiring all renewable energy to be firmed individually, which is possibly about as only a Texan could think up, is the best way I can put it.
No, there's a couple of coalition, I think Josh Frydenberg actually proposed that one under the original NEG scheme, that each solar plant and each wind plant should come with an equivalent amount or a certain percentage of battery storage. So it's not an original idea. It's a really dumb idea, but it's not an original one.
No, and of course, as far as solar plants go, I think the market investors have decided they have to do that for themselves anyway. But I would just want to point out that from a portfolio point of view, it's infinitely more sensible to plan the system from the total amount of renewable energy you're going to have and the total amount of storage, because the portfolio will greatly reduce the amount of storage that's needed. And this comes from standard economics, just reducing the variance of a large portfolio, or has a lower variance than a smaller one. I should have thought that would be obvious, even in Texas, but perhaps they don't do so much school over there.
Well, not now. No, now they've sort of killed the education department. Just one other thing to note. I was talking to Ray Wills, who was one of the original developers of the Cunderdin Solar Battery Project in Western Australia. It was the first, or the biggest at least, DC coupled solar battery. So, we've seen a couple of solar farms with batteries next to them, sort of built after or before or whatever, but there's sort of separate connection points and they play different things in the market. The DC coupled batteries mean it's all behind the meter. It's the solar that goes into the battery, not to the grid. And it basically is by those solar farm owners to extend the output of the solar farms into the evening. So what we're seeing in WA now is that solar farm is not producing so much during the middle of the day and producing more into the evening peaks. So well past dusk, up to 7, 8 or 9 o'clock. And I think it had a couple of dry runs of just very small output for the whole night, just to prove a point. So that's interesting. I think we're going to see more of those coming into we're seeing the Fulham Solar and Battery in Victoria, which is the same DC coupled system, has just started construction, and there's a few others around on the boards.
Next Era has been talking about this for years as a battery adder and showing how the economics work in the United States. And I think in West Australia, they kind of recognise that from what I've been told. The kind of capacity market is credit market there is a bit related to how batteries work. But all of these are the batteries, as much as we need them, they all need the energy to charge them. And by far the most important task still is to get the new big wind farms, the transmission and the utility solar farms built that are going to run the system. And when I look at the long lead items, it's still the transmission and it's still the big wind farms. And, as much as we talk about the roads upgrade that New South Wales Department is doing, and really it was getting that Arana transmission link absolutely finalised. That is the first step in making sure that the generation in that zone gets built so that we can close Araring, close Vales Point, close Bayswater, which managed to close itself yesterday for a little while, and Mount Piper. We have to have those renewable energy zones built. We have to have the wind that goes into them, and the solar, and we have to have the transmission. I mean, that really, the market will solve the battery problem itself. Investors are proving that. Where public policy has to be heavily focused is in getting the basic guts of it done.
Yeah. Absolutely right. And David, on that note, I think we should call an end to this podcast. Thank you very much to Gareth Ridge from Zenobe for joining us once again. Thanks for all the listeners out there. Thanks for all those people who came up and told myself and David at the Smart Energy Conference how much they enjoyed the podcast. Always very gratifying. Do check out some of the other podcasts that we've had. Great one on Solar Insiders with Sophie interviewing Allegra Spender, that great interview with Tony Inder that Andrew Laney has done for Switched On podcast. That was actually last week. There's a new Switched On episode out this week. And we will be back next week. It's a shortened week next week in between Easter and Anzac Day, but we will get an episode of the Energy Insiders podcast out because we know, well, we like to think that you like to listen to it on weekends when you're doing other things. But that's it for now. Goodbye.
Energy Insiders was brought to you by Evergen, the market-leading renewable energy software business that optimises residential and commercial solar and battery systems. Evergen enables large numbers of systems to operate as a single fleet, so network operators can use them as a virtual power plant, generating significant value for consumers, network operators, and the energy system as a whole. Evergen software is powering the energy system of the future. Energy Insiders was also brought to you by Pylon. Pylon provides easy-to-use solar design software for installers and retailers with pay-as-you-go pricing, no monthly cost and no lock-in contracts. Join Australia's top solar companies who trust Pylon to design high-resolution, CEC-ready solar proposals.